Welcome to Traders University online courses. This is lesson 4 in the Margin Online course. In this video, we will talk about margin trading outside of the United States. In this video, we will show you 1. The mechanics of margin trading on a global scale. 2. How non-US margin trading may differ from US margin trading. And 3. Explain the concept of risk management and portfolio building in the context of margin trading. At the end of the video, you'll be asked to take a short quiz to test your understanding. In our prior lessons, we explained the different elements of margin trading in the United States. Refer back to our previous videos on US margin trading for more information. Previously, we learned that in the US, the CFTC regulates margin for commodities using a risk model, while margin trading in US securities is regulated by the SEC using both a rules-based and a risk model. Outside the US, margin requirements can vary. When determining global margin requirements, there are 3 key factors. Number 1. Where are you a citizen or resident? Number 2. Where do you want to trade? Number 3. What products do you want to trade? IB will consider these factors to determine which regulations apply in calculating the margin requirement for your account. Where do you live? This will be your country of legal residence. We collect this information from you to determine what type of margin account you may have and the applicable jurisdiction. You will need to comply with local regulations for margin trading in whatever jurisdiction you reside. For customers of IB LLC, our US-based entity, you will be subject to Securities Exchange Act 15C3-1C11, also known as the Ready Market Rule. This rule generally states that foreign securities are only marginable if there is a ready market for them. This rule also provides the conditions a security must meet to satisfy the ready market rule. IB's systems are designed to indicate which securities fall under the ready market rule and therefore may be purchased on margin. If foreign securities meet the ready market rule, they may be treated as domestic stock for margin purposes. If a security does not meet the definition of ready market, it is not marginable, and any transactions for that security must be paid for in full. For instance, if Jenny wants to buy Japanese securities in an IB LLC account, she will be subject to the ready market rule. That means that there has to be an established security market with bona fide buyers and sellers to create competitive bid and ask quotations. If the security she wishes to purchase falls under the ready market rule, it will be treated similar to a domestic security for margin purposes. This is the basic framework of the rule, but keep in mind that the ready market rule only applies to US entities seeking to trade in foreign securities. If Jenny was a client of IB Canada, IB Hong Kong, or IB Australia, she would be subject to the local margin regulations in those jurisdictions. However, while your margin requirements will typically be governed by the local jurisdiction in which you reside, those governing bodies may have other, more prohibitive regulations. For instance, if Marty is in Mumbai and wants to leverage stocks, he's going to be regulated by India's financial governing bodies. That corresponds to our Canada, Hong Kong, and Australia example. But unlike those other locations, Indian regulation also requires Marty and anyone else investing in Indian securities to be an Indian resident or a non-resident citizen of India. At IB, one must also be a client of IB India to transact in Indian stocks, and those transactions are subject to Indian margin regulation. Where do you want to trade? This is the exchange that the product will be trading on. This is not always the same as where you live, especially if you trade with a broker offering global access. If Marty is from the US and trading stocks on a Hong Kong exchange, then there may be some rules that have to be adhered to from that exchange in addition to those back home. Finally, what products are you trading? Whichever jurisdiction governs the margin requirements on a trade may also have specific margin requirements on the product itself. When you put it all together, you have a matrix of global margin trading criteria that determine your requirements and eligibility. Most leverage trading abroad uses some form of a risk margin model to determine the risk of your portfolio, as opposed to a rule-based system such as Reg T in the US. The model itself may vary depending on the jurisdiction or exchange. The remainder of this video assumes the viewer has a working knowledge of how a risk-based margin model works. For additional details on risk-based margin models, please refer to margin videos 1 and 2. Risk-based margin eligibility requirements vary according to the investor's personal information, region, and exchange. All positions in margin equity securities, including foreign equity securities, warrants on an equity security or index of equity securities, broad-based index futures, are eligible for margin. But remember, if you're an IB LLC customer looking to trade foreign securities on margin, those securities will have to be eligible for margin under the SEC Ready Market rule. Otherwise, they will have to be fully paid. So where would you see the use of risk-based margin? Generally, you will encounter risk-based margin trading in Europe, India, Hong Kong, Japan, and Australia. Notice we didn't mention Canada. That's because Canada operates in a way that's very similar to US securities with a rules-based system. Note that clients of IB Canada are still subject to Canadian margin requirements. There are some exceptions to this. To illustrate, let's look at the margin selector on the IB website. We said that outside of the US, other countries with investors that trade on margin generally use a risk margin model, but let's take another look. If we say that we live in Europe and want to trade on European exchanges and leverage stocks, we get this page. You'll notice that the requirements here are using a rules-based system just like you would see in a US Reg T account. Why is that? Well, at IB, our European entity, IB UK, is actually structured as a fully disclosed introducing broker to our US entity, IB LLC. This means that when trading these equities on margin, you're also going to be subject to US regulations, including its margin requirements. Let's look at another example, this time India. If I select India as my country of residence, as required in order to place an order in an Indian security, notice that I can only select an Indian exchange. At IB, Indian residents are limited to leverage trading on the NSE only and cannot do so abroad with an IB India account. Here we also see an example of a hybrid margin system. Clicking stocks, we can see a pretty straightforward rules-based margin requirement system. But if we click options and/or futures, you'll see that there are requirements that are determined by the rules of the NSE exchange that the products are being traded on. If you explore other jurisdictions and products, you'll also see examples where the margin requirements are a combination of the regulations of the region's governing body as well as the exchange that the products trade on. This concludes Lesson 4 in the Margin Online course. In this video, we introduced margin trading outside of the United States, including the mechanics of international margin trading, the requirements and key differences of margin trading outside of the US, and the components of portfolio building and risk management. When you continue, we'll give you a short quiz to test your understanding of the material we covered today.